On a Tuesday morning in September, while most of America was drinking coffee and scrolling through emails, one man walked into a boardroom and executed a financial maneuver so brilliantly deceptive that by the time the sun set that evening, he was $1 billion richer. The board members who approved it, they had no idea they'd just been played. This is the story of how genius, manipulation, and calculated silence can turn corporate governance into a billion-dollar heist in broad daylight. Before we dive into this absolutely insane story, do me a favor. Type your country in the comments right now. I want to see where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories about power, money, and the psychology of manipulation, hit that subscribe button because this channel is about to become your obsession. Share this with someone who thinks they understand how the game of business really works. Trust me, they don't. Now let's get into it. The story begins. His name was Marcus Whitmore, though very few people outside the inner circles of Silicon Valley venture capital and Wall Street private equity had ever heard of him. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Marcus wasn't a celebrity billionaire. He didn't tweet. He didn't give TED Talks. He didn't appear on magazine covers with his arms crossed, looking visionary. Marcus understood something that most wealthy people forget. Attention is a liability. Silence is power. And the moment you become famous, you become predictable. At 53 years old, Marcus had built his fortune the old-fashioned way by being smarter, more patient, and far more ruthless than everyone else in the room. He started as a derivatives trader in the late 90s, made his first $10 million by shorting the dot-com bubble before anyone else saw it coming, and then spent the next 2 decades quietly accumulating positions in undervalued companies, waiting like a predator in tall grass for the perfect moment to strike. But this story isn't about how Marcus made his first fortune. This is about how he made his biggest one in a single day, using nothing but psychology, leverage, and a boardroom full of people who thought they were smarter than him. The company was called Veldran Systems. You've probably never heard of it, and that's intentional. Veldran wasn't a consumer brand. It didn't make apps or sell shoes or stream movies. Veldran Systems was an enterprise software infrastructure company. Boring, right? Wrong. Veldran controlled critical data architecture for over 40% of Fortune 500 companies. If Veldran Systems went down, entire supply chains would collapse. Payroll systems would freeze. Financial transactions would halt. Veldran was invisible to the public, but absolutely essential to the machinery of modern capitalism, and Marcus owned 18% of it. Now, 18% doesn't sound like controlling interest, and it wasn't. The board was composed of 9 members. Marcus had his seat. There were 3 venture capital representatives who'd funded Veldran's early rounds. There were 2 independent directors, both former CEOs with impressive resumes. There was the company's founder and current CEO, a brilliant but insecure engineer named David Chen, and there were 2 strategic investors from competing private equity firms. On paper, it looked like a balanced, well-governed board. Professional, diverse in perspective, exactly the kind of corporate structure that business schools teach and shareholders celebrate. But Marcus saw it differently. He saw fault lines. He saw egos. He saw hidden alliances and buried resentments. He saw a system that could be exploited if you understood human psychology better than you understood spreadsheets. The opportunity came in the form of an acquisition offer. A massive technology conglomerate called Axiom Global had approached Veldran quietly, expressing interest in acquiring the company for $4.2 billion. It was a good offer. Maybe even a great offer. Veldran's revenue was strong, but growth was slowing. The market was getting crowded. Competition from overseas was intensifying. An exit at $4.2 billion would give all the shareholders a healthy return and all the board members a success story they could add to their portfolios. The board scheduled a meeting to discuss the offer. Standard procedure. Everyone expected a straightforward conversation, review the terms, debate the strategic fit, maybe negotiate for a slightly higher price, and then approve the sale. Everyone except Marcus. Because 3 weeks before that board meeting, Marcus had started making phone calls. Quiet phone calls, casual phone calls, the kind of conversations that seem insignificant in the moment, but plant seeds that bloom later. He called Richard Kolb, one of the venture capital representatives. Richard was 61 years old, managing his fourth fund, and desperately needed a win. His last three investments had underperformed. His limited partners were getting nervous. His position at the firm was becoming precarious. Marcus knew all of this because Marcus made it his business to know everything about everyone he dealt with. The conversation was brief. Marcus mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard rumors Axiom Global was planning major layoffs after the acquisition. Corporate restructuring, they'd call it. Eliminating redundancies, they'd say. But what it really meant was that David Chen, the founder and CEO, would likely be pushed out within 6 months. And when founders get pushed out of their own companies after an acquisition, it sends a signal to the market. It looks messy. It looks like the acquisition wasn't as friendly as everyone claimed. Just something I heard, Marcus said, his voice casual, unattached. Probably nothing, but thought you should know. Richard thanked him and hung up. But the seed was planted. Richard started thinking. If David gets pushed out and it gets ugly, how does that reflect on us as board members? Will it look like we sold out a founder for a quick payout? How will that affect our reputation with other entrepreneurs? Marcus made a similar call to Jennifer Park, one of the independent directors. Jennifer prided herself on being a champion of founder rights and stakeholder capitalism. She'd written articles about it. She spoke at conferences about the importance of long-term thinking versus short-term exits. Marcus casually mentioned that he'd been doing some research on Axiom Global's track record with acquisitions. Their integration process is pretty aggressive, he said. They've acquired 7 companies in the last 5 years. Only 2 of the original leadership teams are still there. The rest were, transitioned out. Interesting, Jennifer said, her tone sharpening. Yeah, Marcus replied. Just makes you wonder about cultural fit, whether this is really the right partner for a company like Veldran. Another seed planted. He had a different conversation with Thomas Brennan, one of the private equity representatives. Thomas was a numbers guy, cold, analytical, unsentimental about business. Marcus didn't talk to Thomas about founder rights or corporate culture. He talked about valuation multiples. He casually mentioned that a competitor to Veldran had just been acquired at a 7 times revenue multiple. Veldran was being offered roughly 5.3 times revenue. Probably just a different market dynamic, Marcus said. But it's interesting, right? Makes you think about whether we're leaving money on the table. Thomas started running numbers in his head before the call even ended. And then, most importantly, Marcus had a conversation with David Chen, the CEO himself. This conversation was the longest and the most carefully constructed. Marcus took David to dinner. Expensive wine. Private room. No phones. Marcus started by complimenting David's vision. He talked about how rare it was to find a founder who truly understood both the technical and strategic sides of the business. He said that Veldran was just beginning to hit its stride, that the next 3 years could be exponential if they stayed independent. But of course, Marcus added, swirling his wine, I understand the appeal of an exit, financial security, validation, the ability to move on to the next thing. David shifted uncomfortably. I mean, it's not about the money, he said, defensive. It's about making sure Veldran reaches its full potential. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. And that's my concern. Does Axiom really understand what you've built? Or do they just see Veldran as a revenue stream to bolt onto their existing infrastructure? David frowned. He'd had the same thought himself, but had pushed it away. Hearing it out loud from someone he respected made it harder to ignore. I've been in this game a long time, Marcus continued, his voice low, almost fatherly. And I've seen brilliant founders sell their companies, thinking it's the right move, only to watch someone else destroy what they built. It's heartbreaking. David went quiet. That night he didn't sleep well. So by the time the board meeting arrived, Marcus had already reshaped the battlefield. He hadn't told anyone what to think. He hadn't made demands or drawn lines in the sand. He'd simply asked questions, raised doubts, shifted perspectives, and he'd done it so subtly that no one realized they were being influenced. The meeting started exactly as expected. Axiom's offer was presented. The terms were reviewed. The CFO walked through the financial projections. It all looked good. clean, reasonable, and then the chairman of the board, an older gentleman named Harold Weston, opened the floor for discussion. Richard Kolb spoke first. He expressed concerns about the cultural fit. He mentioned that Axiom's track record with founder retention wasn't great. He said that while the financial terms were attractive, the board had a responsibility to think about the long-term impact on Veldran's employees and customers. Jennifer Park jumped in next. She agreed with Richard. She talked about stakeholder value and the importance of protecting what David had built. She said she wasn't convinced that Axiom was the right partner. Thomas Brennan, the private equity guy, brought up valuation. He noted that comparable companies had been acquired at higher multiples. He suggested that $4.2 billion might be undervaluing Veldran's strategic importance. David Chen, the CEO, looked conflicted. He said he appreciated the offer from Axiom but admitted he had concerns about whether they truly understood Veldran's mission and culture. One by one, the board members voiced reservations, doubts, hesitations. Harold Weston, the chairman, looked confused. An hour earlier, this had seemed like a straightforward approval. Now the room was filled with uncertainty. And Marcus? Marcus had barely said a word. He sat at the far end of the table, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching. Finally, Harold turned to him. "Marcus, you've been quiet. What's your take?" Marcus paused. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then he leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone in this room is raising valid concerns. And I think those concerns point to a larger question we need to ask ourselves. Are we making this decision because it's the right strategic move for Veldran? Or are we making it because it's the easy move?" The room went quiet. $4.2 billion is a lot of money, Marcus continued. No one's denying that. But Veldran isn't just about money. It's about what David has built. It's about the trust our clients have placed in us. It's about the trajectory we're on. And I'm not convinced that Axiom is the partner who will honor that. He paused again, letting his words sink in. Now, I'm not saying we reject the offer outright, but I am saying we shouldn't rush into a decision just because there's a number on the table. Maybe we table this for now. Maybe we give ourselves time to explore other options. Maybe we see if there are other buyers who align better with our values. Or maybe, and here he looked directly at David, we decide that the best path forward is to stay independent and build something truly transformational. It was a master class in manipulation disguised as wisdom. Marcus had positioned himself as the voice of reason, the defender of principles, the person who cared about more than just money. And because he'd spent the last 3 weeks preloading everyone's concerns into their minds, his words didn't feel like a suggestion. They felt like validation. Harold Weston looked around the table. He saw nodding heads. He saw agreement. "All right," Harold said, "let's table the Axiom offer for now and reconvene in 30 days. In the meantime, David, maybe you and Marcus can explore whether there are alternative paths worth considering." The meeting adjourned, and Marcus walked out of that boardroom knowing he'd just won the first phase of his plan. But rejecting the Axiom offer was never the endgame. It was just the setup. Because here's what nobody in that room knew. Marcus had already been having quiet conversations with another buyer, a strategic acquirer called Titan Edge Capital, a private investment firm with deep pockets and a reputation for letting acquired companies operate independently. Titan Edge had approached Marcus privately 6 weeks earlier, before the Axiom offer even came in. They'd expressed interest in acquiring Veldran for $5.8 billion. That's $1.6 billion more than Axiom's offer. But here's the catch. Titan Edge's offer came with a condition. They wanted Marcus to stay on as chairman of Veldran post-acquisition, with significant operational control and a compensation package that included stock options in the combined entity. In other words, Titan Edge wasn't just buying Veldran. They were buying Marcus's expertise and network. Now, if Marcus had brought this offer to the board alongside Axiom's offer, it would have created a straightforward comparison. The board would have debated both deals, probably chosen Titan Edge's higher offer, and everyone would have walked away happy. But Marcus would have only made whatever his 18% stake entitled him to, roughly $350 million based on his ownership percentage. A lot of money, sure. but not life-changing money for someone who was already worth several hundred million. Marcus wanted more, much more. So instead of presenting both offers together, he killed the Axiom deal first. He used psychology and influence to make the board reject it, creating a narrative that Veldran was too valuable, too special, too important to sell to just anyone. And then, 2 weeks after the board meeting, he scheduled a private dinner with David Chen. "I've been thinking," Marcus said over dinner, "about what's next for Veldran, about your vision, about what it would take to get there." David leaned in, eager. Marcus had become his most trusted advisor. "I've had some preliminary conversations with a firm called Titan Edge Capital," Marcus continued. "They're different from Axiom. They understand the long game. They're willing to let you stay on as CEO with full operational control. They believe in the mission, and they're prepared to offer significantly more than Axiom did." David's eyes widened. "How much more?" "5.8 billion. David nearly choked on his wine. "But here's the thing," Marcus said, his tone serious. "They need a guarantee of stability. They need to know that the leadership structure will remain intact. They want me to transition into the chairman role officially, which would allow you to focus purely on product and vision, while I handle the board and investor relations." David nodded eagerly. That sounded perfect to him. He'd never enjoyed the corporate politics side of the job anyway. "There's one other component," Marcus added carefully. "As part of the deal, they're offering me an equity package in the combined entity, plus some performance-based compensation tied to Veldran's growth over the next 5 years. It's a meaningful package, but it's contingent on the deal closing and on Veldran hitting certain milestones." Marcus made it sound like this was just a detail, a footnote, a standard compensation structure. What he didn't tell David was the actual size of that package. He didn't mention that the performance-based compensation was structured in a way that would give Marcus effective control over nearly 30% of the voting rights in the combined entity. He didn't mention that the deal terms included a clause allowing Marcus to sell his equity stake back to Titan Edge at a guaranteed premium after just 18 months. He didn't mention any of that because David didn't ask. David was too excited about the headline number, 5.8 billion, the validation, the vindication of his vision. "This sounds incredible," David said. "When can we bring it to the board?" "Soon," Marcus replied, "but let's make sure the terms are finalized first. I want to make sure this is bulletproof before we present it. The last thing we need is another situation like Axiom, where we get everyone excited and then it falls apart." David agreed. Marcus had positioned himself as the careful, strategic thinker protecting David's interests. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus worked with Titan Edge's lawyers to structure the deal. Every clause was carefully negotiated. Every term was designed to maximize Marcus's upside while keeping the overall deal attractive enough that the board wouldn't question it too deeply. The compensation package Marcus negotiated for himself was buried in a 230-page merger agreement. It was written in dense legal language. It was positioned as a retention and performance incentive necessary to ensure continuity and success. And it was worth, conservatively, $1.1 billion over the life of the agreement. But nobody knew that, because nobody read the fine print closely enough. And the few who did read it didn't understand the compounding effect of the various clauses and options and guarantees that Marcus's lawyers had woven throughout the document. When the deal was finally ready, Marcus called another board meeting. This time the energy was different. There was anticipation, excitement. After rejecting the Axiom offer, the board was eager to see what alternative Marcus and David had found. Marcus presented the Titan Edge offer with perfect calm. He walked through the terms. He highlighted the higher valuation. He emphasized Titan Edge's commitment to preserving Veldran's culture and letting David remain as CEO. The board members were thrilled. This was everything they'd hoped for, a better financial outcome and a strategic partner who understood the company's mission. Richard Kolb called it a win-win. Jennifer Park called it exactly the kind of deal that honors stakeholder value. Thomas Brennan called it a significant improvement in valuation that reflects Veldran's true worth. Harold Weston, the chairman, beamed. "This is what good governance looks like," he said. "We took our time. We didn't rush. And we found a much better outcome. The vote was unanimous. The deal was approved. And Marcus sat at that table, nodding humbly, accepting congratulations, while inside he was calculating the exact figure, $1,070,000,000. That's what his compensation package, equity options, and guaranteed buyback clause would be worth over the 18-month period following the acquisition. He just manipulated an entire board into approving a deal that made him a billionaire in a single day, and they were thanking him for it. The acquisition closed 60 days later. The press release went out. Industry analysts praised the deal. Shareholders celebrated. David Chen was featured in a glowing profile in a tech publication about founder-friendly acquisitions, and Marcus quietly began executing the next phase of his plan. See, the performance milestones that triggered his compensation weren't actually that difficult to hit. Marcus had negotiated them himself, so he knew exactly what levers to pull. Within 6 months, Veldran hit every target. Marcus's equity vested. His options became exercisable. And then, exactly 18 months after the acquisition closed, Marcus exercised his buyback clause. Titan Edge, bound by the contract they'd signed, bought back his equity stake at the guaranteed premium. Marcus walked away with $1 billion in liquid cash. He resigned from the board, citing a desire to pursue other interests. He released a gracious statement thanking David, the team, and Titan Edge for a successful partnership. And then he disappeared. No interviews, no victory laps, no social media posts about his success. He simply vanished back into the same obscurity he'd operated from before. It took almost a year before anyone started piecing together what had actually happened. A financial journalist working on a deep dive about corporate governance structures noticed something odd in the Veldran-Titan Edge merger documents. The compensation package for Marcus Whitmore seemed unusually complex and unusually generous. She started digging. She talked to lawyers. She reviewed securities filings. She built a model of how the various clauses and options and guarantees compounded together. When she finally published her article, the headline read, "The Billion-Dollar Boardroom: How One Investor Engineered the Most Profitable Single-Day Payday in Corporate History." The article detailed everything: the rejected Axiom offer, the pre-loaded board conversations, the psychological manipulation, the carefully structured compensation package, the guaranteed buyback clause. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, and it revealed Marcus Whitmore as either a genius or a villain, depending on your perspective. The board members were humiliated. Richard Kolb resigned from his venture capital firm. Jennifer Park faced questions about her judgment. Thomas Brennan's private equity fund launched an internal review of how they'd approved the deal. David Chen, the CEO, was devastated. He felt betrayed, used. He'd trusted Marcus, considered him a mentor, and realized too late that he'd been a pawn in a much larger game. But here's the thing. Everything Marcus did was legal. He hadn't committed fraud. He hadn't lied. He hadn't broken any securities laws. He'd simply understood the rules of the game better than anyone else and played them to perfection. The compensation package was disclosed in the merger documents. It was available for review. The board had the opportunity to scrutinize it. They just didn't. They trusted Marcus. They believed his narrative. They made assumptions. And those assumptions cost them $1 billion. In the aftermath, corporate governance experts studied the Veldran case like a textbook example of board failure. Business schools added it to their curriculum. New regulations were proposed to prevent similar situations. But Marcus didn't care about any of that. He'd already moved on. He bought a compound in New Zealand. He started a family office to manage his wealth. He made a few philanthropic donations, mostly to educational causes, but nothing that drew significant attention. And he began quietly building his next position in his next undervalued company, waiting patiently for the next perfect moment to strike. Because here's what Marcus understood that most people don't. The game never ends. Wealth isn't about one big score. It's about pattern recognition. It's about understanding systems and people and leverage. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. It's about planting seeds months before you need them to bloom. Marcus knew that boards aren't rational decision-making bodies. They're collections of human beings with egos, insecurities, ambitions, and blind spots. And if you understand those human elements better than you understand spreadsheets, You can guide outcomes in ways that seem like consensus, but are actually orchestration. He knew that information asymmetry is the most valuable asset in any negotiation. The person who knows more, who's had more conversations, who's thought 3 moves ahead, will almost always win. He knew that the best manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like wisdom. It feels like shared values. It feels like everyone arriving at the same conclusion independently. And he knew that in the world of high finance, legal isn't the same as ethical, and ethical isn't the same as smart, and smart isn't the same as successful. Marcus chose successful. Now you might be wondering, how should we feel about Marcus Whitmore? Is he a brilliant strategist who beat the system? Or is he a manipulative predator who exploited trust and governance failures? The answer is probably both. Marcus didn't break the law, but he absolutely broke the spirit of good faith dealing. He weaponized relationships. He exploited cognitive biases. He used his understanding of human psychology to extract value in ways that the other board members never saw coming. But he also exposed real weaknesses in how corporate boards function. He revealed that even sophisticated, experienced business leaders can be influenced and guided if you understand their motivations and fears. He proved that the entire system of corporate governance relies on trust, and when someone is willing to betray that trust strategically, the system has very few defenses. The Veldran case changed things, not dramatically but meaningfully. Boards became more skeptical of complex compensation packages. Law firms developed new checklists for merger reviews. Corporate governance consultants built practices around identifying potential conflicts of interest and influence campaigns. But none of that changes what happened. Marcus Whitmore walked into a boardroom on a Tuesday morning and walked out that evening having secured a billion-dollar payday that most of the board didn't even realize they'd approved. It's one of the most sophisticated, calculated, and successful manipulations in modern corporate history. And the scariest part? Marcus probably isn't the only one doing it. He's just the one who got caught. Think about that. Right now, at this very moment, there are board meetings happening in conference rooms around the world. There are deals being discussed. There are votes being taken. And in some of those rooms, there's someone like Marcus. Someone who's been planting seeds for weeks or months. Someone who's had quiet conversations that seemed innocuous at the time, but are about to pay off spectacularly. Someone who understands that the real game isn't played in the boardroom. It's played in the dinners beforehand, the phone calls, the casual mentions, the strategic silences. The game is always happening. Most people just don't realize they're playing. So what's the lesson here? What should you take away from the story of Marcus Whitmore and his billion-dollar Tuesday? First, understand that information is power, but selective information is a weapon. Marcus didn't lie to anyone. He just shared different pieces of truth with different people at different times, knowing that those pieces would shape their perspectives in the direction he wanted. Second, timing is everything. Marcus could have presented both offers to the board simultaneously. Instead, he killed one first, created a narrative, and then introduced the second in a context where it looked like salvation rather than just another option. Third, trust is the most exploitable currency in business. Every single person in that boardroom trusted Marcus because he'd earned that trust over years, and he spent all of that accumulated trust capital in a single day to execute his plan. Fourth, complexity is camouflage. Marcus's compensation package wasn't hidden, it was disclosed. But it was so complex, buried in so much legal language, structured with so many interdependent clauses, that even sophisticated board members couldn't fully understand its value. Complexity creates the illusion of thoroughness while actually obscuring truth. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, never assume that everyone at the table has the same agenda. Marcus sat in that boardroom as a trusted colleague, but his incentives were completely different from everyone else's. He didn't want what was best for Veldran or its shareholders in general. He wanted what was best for Marcus, and he structured the entire situation to achieve exactly that. These lessons aren't just for billionaires and board members. They apply to every negotiation, every business deal, every situation where people come together to make decisions that involve money and power. The person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. The person who understands the other player's motivations better than they understand them themselves will win. The person who's willing to think 10 moves ahead while everyone else is focused on the next one will extract the most value. Marcus Whitmore is exceptional, not because he's smarter than everyone else, though he probably is. He's exceptional because he understands that business at the highest levels is fundamentally about human psychology. The numbers matter, sure. The strategy matters. The market dynamics matter. But what matters most is understanding the people across the table from you better than they understand themselves. And that's a skill that can't be taught in business school. It can only be learned through observation, experience, and a certain kind of ruthless clarity about human nature. Marcus had that clarity. He saw the board members not as colleagues, but as variables in an equation. He identified their fears, their ambitions, their insecurities, and he calibrated his approach to each one individually. He was a psychologist wearing a financier's suit. The question you have to ask yourself is, in your own life, in your own business dealings, are you Marcus? Or are you one of the board members who got played? Most of us, if we're honest, are the board members. We trust. We take things at face value. We assume good faith. We focus on the immediate decision in front of us without considering the longer game that someone else might be playing. And there's nothing wrong with that. Trust makes society function. Good faith makes collaboration possible. Not everyone needs to be a Machiavellian strategist gaming every interaction. But you should at least be aware that people like Marcus exist. You should ask questions. You should dig into the complexity when something seems too intricate. You should consider what incentives are really at play. You should think about who benefits most from the decision you're about to make. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is having quiet dinners, making casual phone calls, planting seeds, and setting up their own billion-dollar Tuesday. The game is always being played. The only question is whether you're aware of it. Final CTA. So that's the story of Marcus Whitmore and the billion-dollar boardroom manipulation that changed corporate governance forever. If this blew your mind, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, drop your country in the comments. I want to know where my smartest viewers are watching from. Second, smash that subscribe button because I'm bringing you more stories like this. Stories about power, psychology, and the hidden games that shape our world. And third, share this video with someone who needs to understand how the real game is played. They'll thank you later. See you in the next one. 1 best viral video titles in 10 options. The billionaire who manipulated his board to make $1 billion overnight. How one man psychologically tricked a boardroom into making him a billionaire. The $1 billion corporate heist that was completely legal. Billionaire reveals how I manipulated 9 board members in one meeting. The Tuesday that made him $1,000 and nobody saw it coming. How a silent billionaire turned board psychology into $1 billion. The billion-dollar manipulation inside the most brilliant corporate con ever. He said nothing in the meeting. He left with $1 billion. Former board member exposes the 1B deception. We all approved the psychological trick that turned one board meeting into $1 billion to best SEO. Optimize YouTube description, 2,000 plus words. The most brilliant billion-dollar corporate manipulation ever executed. What happens when a billionaire understands board psychology better than he understands spreadsheets? You get the most sophisticated, calculated, and successful corporate manipulation in modern business history. This is the true story of Marcus Whitmore, a man who turned one Tuesday board meeting into a $1 billion payday that nobody saw coming until it was far too late. The setup. When silence becomes a weapon. This isn't your typical billionaire success story. Marcus Whitmore didn't build a revolutionary product. He didn't invent the next big technology. He didn't even take a massive financial risk. What Marcus did was far more strategic, far more calculated, and infinitely more manipulative. He understood that in the world of corporate governance, perception is reality, and whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome. The story centers around Veldran Systems, an enterprise software infrastructure company that most people had never heard of, but that controlled critical data architecture for over 40% of Fortune 500 companies. Marcus owned 18% of the company and sat on its 9-member board. When a major technology conglomerate offered to acquire Veldran for $4.2 billion, it seemed like a straightforward decision. Good valuation, clean terms, time to take the money and run. But Marcus saw something different. He saw an opportunity. The psychology, how to manipulate without anyone knowing what makes this story absolutely fascinating, is how Marcus executed his plan. He didn't make demands. He didn't threaten. He didn't even explicitly state what he wanted. Instead, he spent 3 weeks before the crucial board meeting having quiet, casual conversations with each board member individually. He planted seeds of doubt. He raised questions. He shared selective information that would shape their perspectives in exactly the direction he needed. To the venture capital representative who was desperate for a win, Marcus casually mentioned rumors about post-acquisition layoffs and how that might reflect poorly on the board. To the independent director who prided herself on stakeholder capitalism, he raised concerns about cultural fit and founder rights. To the private equity analyst, he dropped hints about valuation multiples that suggested they might be leaving money on the table. And to the CEO himself, Marcus positioned himself as a trusted mentor, raising legitimate concerns about whether the acquiring company truly understood the vision. By the time the board meeting happened, Marcus had already won. He hadn't told anyone what to think, but he'd carefully calibrated their concerns so that when the discussion began, the room naturally moved in the direction he wanted. The acquisition offer was rejected, not because Marcus pushed for rejection, but because every other board member had independently arrived at concerns that made them hesitant. The execution, $1 billion hidden in plain sight. Here's where the story gets truly remarkable. Marcus had been having secret conversations with a different buyer, Titan Edge Capital, who was willing to pay $5.8 billion for Veldran, significantly more than the rejected offer. But the deal came with a massive compensation package for Marcus himself, including equity options, performance bonuses, and a guaranteed buyback clause that was buried in 230 pages of merger documentation. When Marcus presented this better deal to the board 2 weeks later, they were thrilled. Higher valuation, better strategic fit, everything they'd hoped for after rejecting the first offer. The vote was unanimous, the deal was approved, and Marcus walked away having secured a compensation package worth over $1 billion that most of the board didn't even fully understand they'd approved. The aftermath, when the truth finally emerged. It took nearly a year for a financial journalist to piece together what had actually happened. When the story broke, it sent shockwaves through the corporate governance world. Board members resigned in humiliation. The CEO felt betrayed. Corporate governance experts studied the case as a textbook example of how sophisticated manipulation can exploit even experienced business leaders. But here's the most important detail. Everything Marcus did was completely legal. He hadn't committed fraud. He hadn't broken securities laws. He'd simply understood the rules of the game better than anyone else and played them to absolute perfection. The compensation package was disclosed in the merger documents. It was available for review. The board had the opportunity to scrutinize it. They just didn't. They trusted Marcus. They believed his narrative, and that trust cost them $1 billion. The lessons. What this teaches us about power, psychology, and business. This story reveals several critical insights about how power actually works at the highest levels of business. Information asymmetry is everything. Marcus knew more than everyone else in the room. He'd had more conversations. He'd thought further ahead. He understood the full landscape while others only saw pieces of it. That informational advantage was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Timing shapes perception. By rejecting the first offer before presenting the second, Marcus created a narrative where the Titan Edge deal looked like salvation rather than just another option. Context determines value, and Marcus controlled the context completely. Trust is the most valuable and most exploitable currency. Every person in that boardroom trusted Marcus because he'd spent years earning that trust. And he spent all of that accumulated trust capital in a single day to execute his billion-dollar plan. Complexity camouflages truth. Marcus's compensation package wasn't hidden. It was disclosed in the merger documents, but it was so complex, so buried in legal language, so structured with interdependent clauses, that even sophisticated board members couldn't fully grasp its true value until it was too late. The real game happens before the meeting. While everyone else was focused on what would happen in the boardroom, Marcus was playing a completely different game in the dinners, phone calls, and casual conversations that happened weeks beforehand. By the time the formal meeting occurred, the outcome was already determined. Why this story matters now more than ever. We live in an era where we celebrate transparency, good governance, and stakeholder capitalism. We have regulations and compliance frameworks designed to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation. And yet Marcus Whitmore pulled it off anyway because he understood a fundamental truth. All of those systems are still operated by human beings with human psychology, human biases, and human blind spots. The scariest part of this story isn't that it happened once. It's that it's probably happening right now in boardrooms around the world. There are people having quiet dinners, making strategic phone calls, planting seeds, and setting up their own billion-dollar paydays while everyone else focuses on the immediate decision in front of them. What you need to understand, whether you're an entrepreneur, an investor, a board member, or just someone trying to understand how the world really works, this story contains lessons that apply far beyond corporate boardrooms. Every negotiation, every business deal, every situation where people come together to make decisions about money and power, the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome. The person who understands the other player's motivations better than they understand themselves will win. The person willing to think 10 moves ahead while everyone else focuses on the next one will extract the most value. Marcus Whitmore is exceptional not because he's necessarily smarter than everyone else, though he probably is. He's exceptional because he understands that business at the highest levels is fundamentally about human psychology. The numbers matter. The strategy matters. The market dynamics matter. But what matters most is understanding the people across the table from you better than they understand themselves. The question you must ask yourself: in your own life, in your own business dealings, are you Marcus Whitmore? Or are you one of the board members who got played? Most of us, if we're honest, are the board members. We trust. We take things at face value. We assume good faith. We focus on the immediate decision without considering the longer game someone else might be playing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Trust makes society function. Good faith makes collaboration possible. Not everyone needs to be a Machiavellian strategist gaming every interaction, but you should at least be aware that people like Marcus exist. You should ask questions. You should dig into complexity when something seems too intricate. You should consider what incentives are really at play. You should think about who benefits most from the decision you're about to make. What happens next? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the hidden games of power, wealth, and influence that shape our world. Stories like Marcus Whitmore's reveal how the game is really played at the highest levels. Subscribe now because we're diving deep into more stories of psychological manipulation, strategic brilliance, and the dark art of corporate warfare that business schools won't teach you. If you found this story valuable, share it with someone who needs to understand how these games are played. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see where my most intelligent viewers are watching from around the world. And hit that like button if you want more content that pulls back the curtain on how billionaires, boards, and power brokers really operate. The game is always being played. The only question is whether you're aware of it